What's up, guys? Now I'm going to first of all straight off the bat apologise for that noise. Oh, there you go, it stops. I live next door to a church, and on a Monday evening, and it is now 9 o'clock, so again apologies for the lateness of this video, but there is bell ringing practice going on and I've waited as late as I can. I can't wait any longer, so I'm just going to have to crack on and we will have to deal with it. So hopefully you'll find it a nice soothing noise, but apologies if it becomes drowning out over my voice. Anyway, what a Grand Prix. Wow! German Grand Prix was unbelievable, and what a trio of Grand Prix we've had since that really dull French Grand Prix, the Austrian race, the British race, and now the German race. Off the charts spectacular. So I hope you enjoyed it wherever you were watching. It was just brilliant. I actually had to watch it again last night for a second time because I got to the end of it. So much had happened, I couldn't even remember what had happened in the first part of the Grand Prix, so I had to watch it again, kind of get it into my head exactly which points people were doing which things, which round of pit stops, which round of safety cars things were happening. It was all going off, and as ever, you never let me down. Loads and loads of brilliant questions and talking points. So let's get into another Ask Elvis. Right, let's start at the start of the race. And this question from Richard Shaw is talking about the restart procedure that we saw for the first time at the German round. And he says, what do you think about the new standing start procedure after the safety car formation laps? I think it's unfair as it creates a drier line on one side of the track, disadvantaging the offline grid positions even further. Well, there's two halves to that question, so let's take the second part first. It's not really a disadvantage to the guys who are starting on the right-hand side of the grid, because when they're doing their laps behind the safety car, it's totally up to them to be able to drive on their side of the grid to sort of dry up a clear line at their side. Oh, thanks, Mrs. P. Tea delivery. It's totally up to the guys who are starting on the right-hand side of the grid to do their formation laps behind the safety car and use that side of the grid to travel along the start-finish straight, thereby clearing up a dry line over their grid slots. There's nothing that says they have to take the racing line and thereby clear up the slots on the other side of the grid, which would then be an advantage only to those people starting on the racing line. So that's not really an issue, because the sensible ones would have absolutely been driving over their own grid slots as much as possible. The other part of the question, what do you think of that restart procedure? I liked it, and the reason I liked it is because we got to see a standing start, which in previous generations of Formula One, that just wouldn't have happened. We'd have started the race behind the safety car and we'd have lost out on all of that drama and excitement and action that happens the moment those lights go out. You know, the fact that Verstappen and Gasly got terrible starts, others made their way up, jumping massive amounts of positions, massive number of positions from the grid. So that's an important part of any Grand Prix, that standing start. And given that it was wet and treacherous conditions, I don't think it was so wet that it was, you know, any more dangerous, but given that it was wet, we saw so much variation in start performance levels that we got, you know, this whole mixed up order, which was absolutely brilliant. So I like it as a rule. I think it's great, and we saw the full benefits of it yesterday by having formation laps behind the safety car, but then a full restart or a full normal grid start at the end of that procedure. So I liked it. Thumbs up from me. Right, this next question I'm going to take from the Seed Stream app, and before I just answer this question, just want to say a quick thanks to everybody who took part and got involved in Seed Stream over the weekend, because there were lots of people having big discussions with me about different elements of the race, about different elements of the Grand Prix weekend. Loads of people posting questions and pictures and videos, and I put my own content on there as well. So thank you to anybody who got involved, and I just wanted to remind everybody that if you haven't yet got the Seed Stream app, please feel free to check it out. I'll link it all in the description of this video. It's still in its full beta version or test phase, so not the finished polished article, but I'm reminding you all that if you haven't got it, Ollie, who's a mate of mine who's right behind this whole thing, it's his baby, has promised everybody who signs up before the end of July that you will get 2 years worth of free content once it is finished and becomes a premium app. So you've got nothing to lose. You might as well sign up, download the app from the App Store in either Apple or Android, totally free, and there won't be anything like data being sold off to marketing organisations. There's nothing like that. It's literally just an app. Once you get in there, you sign up to the Formula One seed within the SeedStream app, and you'll just get loads of Formula One content thrown into your face every single day. You'll get content from me, and we're building a nice little community over there. So well worth checking out, and that is exactly what Victor Aguilar has done. And he asked this question, which is also around this idea, because this was a race dominated, or at least punctuated by penalties, even during the race, and then again even after the race. And he asks this one: was Lewis penalised enough? Hamilton's missing the bollard and getting 5 seconds seemed fair, but was it? If he'd followed correct protocol and limped around the entire lap, wouldn't he have lost far more than just 5 seconds? Just wondering. Well, I think that's a fairly valid point. There are 2 ways to look at this whole thing. In fact, there's probably 3 ways to look at it. First of all, there will be lots of people screaming out saying he shouldn't have had a penalty because it was safer for him to do what he did and cross that grass, go the other side of the bollard to get into the pits, rather than limp his way around the circuit with a broken car in treacherous conditions. That would have been dangerous, to have a slow-moving car with all the spray. That's a valid argument too. So the fact that Lewis decided to cut that corner, go past the bollard and make a late entry into the pits, you could say was the safer of the 2 options. That's not why Lewis did it, obviously. Lewis did it because he wanted to save himself an extra, totally wasted lap out on track and a whole load of time. That's why he did it. So he did it for performance advantage, of course. There's no way that I don't think even the hardcorest Lewis Hamilton fan could sit there and say he was thinking about safety. Of course he wasn't. He's a racing driver. He was thinking about performance. So he gained a huge amount of performance by not following protocol. Therefore, was the penalty perhaps a bit lenient in that regard? And I don't know. I think actually it was probably the right call. But there is an argument to say that if it had been a more heavy penalty, like a drive-through, which might more have equated to the time that he essentially saved by not doing the extra lap, maybe there's a fair argument to say that would have been okay or fair too. So, and then there's an argument, should he have had a penalty at all? Because lots of people will say that. And I would say, yes, he absolutely should have had a penalty. And I think having gone over it all, I think the stewards are probably about right to do that. And there are lots of people saying there's a precedent because this happened before and it didn't result in the same kind of penalty. And that's also a valid argument. But I would say that, whilst we can look at past decisions and call them precedents, which they are in many regards, it doesn't mean they were always right, or they were always the right call, or they should be the right call now. And I think that's another thing where we should be allowed to give stewards the freedom to make what they see as some kind of common sense decisions based within a framework of rules. We can't just can't be the Wild West out there, but we've got to let them have a framework of rules that gives them some scope to apply what they think is common sense. And I think if we look at what happened over the course of this weekend, I think pretty much that's what they did. I even think that's what they did with the Charles Leclerc incident. And that was another question. So let's look at that one. Because Helge Kuista says, it's great to see a team penalised for an unsafe release and not the driver, talking about Leclerc, of course. But how can they change that rule during the season when others were penalised, for example, Verstappen in Monaco, 5 seconds? So, again, a valid point. How can they change their decision on what was almost an identical incident, I guess? I know there was contact in Monaco, but it's the same thing. It's releasing a car into the path of another one. You can even go back to the British Grand Prix and say when Verstappen and Leclerc came out of their pit stops and Verstappen had that blistering pit stop and was released right into the path of Charles Leclerc and they went down the pit lane almost next to each other. Was that not an unsafe release? And there are many people, and I would have to have some sympathy with you if you say, yes, that was an unsafe release, but it was totally ignored by the stewards. In that instance, I'm really pleased they ignored it. There was enough room to have 2 cars go down the pit lane without it being necessarily dangerous. One guy didn't have to brake or make evasive manoeuvres necessarily to avoid a collision. It was one of those that was mighty close, but really highlighted the unbelievable human performance of that Red Bull team in the pit stop, and that was what I loved about it. If it had been penalised, why would you ever bother racing in that situation in the pit stop? So again, I would like to think there's been some common sense, but I did think that this Ferrari incident this weekend where the team was given a fine was a strange one, because an unsafe release, that penalty is there because it's a dangerous situation. And you can't look at that and say it wasn't dangerous. It was exactly the same level of danger as others that we've had over the years. And the reason that, it's not just about two cars hitting each other. It's about two cars hitting each other in a heavily populated and condensed area of the pit lane. That's why we need to keep it safe. So if you're going to do that, is a fine really a deterrent for a big team? It's not, because a fine means absolutely nothing. So that's why we have these heavy penalties for unsafe release, because it's deemed as being an unsafe situation, and therefore we need a heavy deterrent to stop people doing it. So I think, in my view, what we should be doing now is having a look at this, and again, giving the stewards some kind of framework where they might be allowed to take each case as a case by case and look at it with a little bit of common sense. But I think instead of just saying it should be one size fits all, one penalty fits every incident, let's look at them all and let's judge each one on a case by case. But a fine, for me, that doesn't really cut it. That's nothing. That's not a penalty to a Formula 1 team. Right, ND says, when Gasly crashed in FP2, the commentator said he won't have his race gearbox in. Why are they allowed to use a different gearbox? Also, can they use a different engine before qualifying and race day? Yes, they can. So the Parc Fermé rules, if you like, don't kick in until qualifying. So you could even run a different engine and gearbox in free practice 3 on a Saturday morning if you wanted to, and change it before qualifying. They don't do that because there isn't really time, or it'd be too much time pressure to change all of that between FP3 and qualifying. So what happens is typically teams will run an old engine or an old gearbox, a practice engine and gearbox that is not going to be their race unit on Fridays when they're doing all the miles, all the testing, and then on Friday night when the car comes apart in the evenings on a Friday, that's when the race units will go in. They'll be run through free practice 3, where they get an opportunity to check everything, check all the systems are plumbed in right, make sure there's no issues, and then of course it's into qualifying. Criluminati says, how does it feel to be a race mechanic during races like the German Grand Prix? Well, it totally depends on which team you're at. If you're a mechanic at Mercedes this weekend, you probably come away from that race feeling awful, because not only did the team have a disastrous weekend, utterly disastrous, of course that pit stop, that calamitous pit stop for Lewis Hamilton, made everybody look like utter fools. And that's, it's easy to look on at that situation and think, my goodness, what a bunch of clowns, they don't know what they're doing. That's obviously not what it is. It's total communication breakdown, because it was a last minute decision. They didn't have tyres ready. They had a different set of procedures about to be activated, waiting for a car to come in with a different set of tyres. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, the other car turns up and it's Lewis Hamilton. So you've got the wrong tyres prepared. So you need to get rid of those. You need to be very careful to make sure they don't go onto a car. You then need to have your pit wall make a decision, not only as to what you're going to do to the car, but which tyres are going to go on. We know it's going to be for Lewis, but is it going to be softs? Is it going to be intermediates? Is it going to be mediums? And they need to very quickly make that decision and communicate it in a very clear fashion to the pit crew. We don't know if any of that happened. There could well have been conflicting decisions and discussions going on between Lewis in the car and the pit wall and the chief mechanic to his crew. All of that's happening in the space of split seconds when we're watching on telly, people just what appears to be running around in circles getting utterly confused. And on top of that, of course, we had a nose change and all sorts going on. So, of course, it looks terrible, it looks calamitous, almost looks, comedic. But when you're a mechanic in that situation, it's awful, because when it's happening, you know that it looks calamitous, and you also know that it's not your fault. There are a number of people you're relying on to make decisions, and yet those decisions sometimes cannot be made just like that, because the discussions have to happen. Normally, of course, that happens well before the car arrives in the pit lane. So what does it feel to be a mechanic in races like that? If you're a mechanic on somebody like Daniel Kvyat's car that has come from nowhere with a great strategic decision, a great pit stop to end up landing on the podium, then it's one of the best feelings in the world. If you're Mercedes, you cannot wait to get home. Alex N says, "Hi Mark, whilst watching the German Grand Prix on TV, I saw little white air particles on the corners of the rear wings, especially on the straights. Could you explain what they are? Thanks, keep up the good work." Thanks very much, Alex. Now, I know lots of you might already know this because it's something that gets talked about every now and again by the commentators, but we saw it, of course, in Germany because what it is, Alex, is essentially the moisture in the air. Because there was such a high moisture content, of course, given the climatic conditions, the moisture in the air as a car travels at high speed down a straight, and the aerodynamic surfaces, they're almost squeezing the moisture out of the air because of the velocity that it's travelling through. And what you're seeing, those little vortices spinning off the rear wing, is the moisture content being almost purged from the air, being squeezed into that trail that ends up being so densely populated with moisture that you can see it. Normally, of course, you can't because the moisture particles are so sparse and invisible to the naked eye, but at this point they become so condensed you start to see it on the TV screens. It's a really interesting thing to see and get pictures, and the teams do this on wet races. They will take photographs specifically of those little vortices coming off every part of the car to get a picture and an idea of how the aerodynamics work on each of the individual sets of components up and down the pit lane. But it's quite interesting and nice for us as fans to be able to see those kind of things that you normally would only ever see perhaps in a wind tunnel or through CFD simulation. Signed C? Sined C? Don't know if I got that right, apologies if I haven't. Hello, can you explain in layman's terms what was wrong with the Alfa Romeo's cars? Lots of you asking about this. Well, it's essentially, if you remember, we used to have a system on a Formula 1 car where at the race start you would have your 2 clutch paddles on the back of the steering wheel, and the driver could sit in there during the start procedure. When the lights went out, he would literally let go of one panel, dump the clutch, and that would take it to a preset take the clutch itself to a preset position, which is the bite point. That would start to get the car moving. As the car starts to build up speed, he could then release the other lever, which would feed in the remaining portion of the clutch engagement, if you like, and that would continue or complete your launch process. But as that driver's feeding in the clutch paddles, the system, the software, was able to generate a sort of clutch torque map. If you looked at it on a graph, it would be a curve. And if the driver were to release the clutch paddle, let's say 5mm, you could have the system engage the clutch, or the clutch operation, by any number of millimeters. It didn't have to be 5, let's say, as an example. So your clutch paddle operation and your clutch operation did not have to be linear. Well, now they do. Now the rules say that if you move the clutch paddle by 1mm, the clutch on the engine has to move by 1mm as well. So it has to be exactly the same amount of movement. It's linear. Now, there is in the rules and a certain amount of leeway in terms of when you move that 1mm, when you release your clutch paddle 1mm, let's say, within 70 milliseconds, the actual clutch has to move that distance as well. And what happened with the Alfa cars was there was something picked up on the software that said when they were releasing that clutch paddle, it took longer than the 70 milliseconds. I think one of the cars was 200 milliseconds, one was about 300 milliseconds. That's just from memory, and maybe I've got that wrong, but it was something like that. And what that essentially gives you is a little bit more leeway and a little bit more of a gentle impact in your clutch engagement, and therefore perhaps a little bit more of opportunity to not spin the wheels up. It's not such an abrupt dumping of the clutch, and in those conditions that's exactly what you would like to have. So essentially that could be described in a way that it could aid traction on a wet start. Now, I'm not saying for a second that was something that Alfa were cheating with. I don't think that was the situation. I think it was an anomaly in the software, given that they had never done starts, in those conditions with these tyres and with this car. They had a number of formation laps, of course. So I think the whole process was slightly different to normal, and it just caught them out. But rules is rules, and whether it's breaking it by a couple of milliseconds or not, I think if you break a rule like that, which is pretty black and white, you've got to take the penalty. So a harsh one for the guys, because they had such a great race, both Alfas in the points at that point. It was a real shame, but it's the rules. Jason Lee. Hello Mark, now that it seems there's a budget cap agreed in F1, why can't there just be total freedom in the regs as long as they don't go over budget cap, as an alternative to becoming nearly a spec series? Well, first of all, I don't think Formula One's anywhere close to becoming a spec series. I think we're a long way from that happening. But to answer the first part, why couldn't they just have freedom of technical freedom if they agree to sign up to a budget cap? You know, this was an idea that I loved when it was first tabled, I think by Max Mosley, quite a long time ago. They were talking at that time about you could either sign up to a budget cap and have more freedom, whether it's total freedom or more freedom in the technical regs, or you don't sign up to the budget cap and yet you have to then abide by the fairly restrictive Formula One technical regulations, which I thought was a really interesting idea back then. Because what do you do if you're a big team? Do you use the extra budget to maximise what's available to you within the regs? Or do you bring the budget down to a level that puts a much more even level playing field across the grid and yet have the freedom to be innovative, to be creative, to come up with some incredible ideas, performance generating ideas? For me, that would be the one that would be most attractive, and therefore we'd get this brilliant innovation in Formula One, we'd get lower spending across the board generally, and we'd also get a more level playing field because everyone's operating at the same or similar budget level. So I thought it was a great idea. So yes, Jason, I totally agree with you. Why can't we do that if we've got a budget cap? I think we can. The problem is at the moment is that the budget cap that they're talking about, although it's great we are talking and having discussions about budget caps, it's still at a fairly astronomical level if you ask any of the smaller teams. So it's not like we're levelling the playing field with this budget cap that's being proposed for 2021. We are literally at the very first stage of that. It's a positive, but it's not to the point where we might start evening things out. So there's still some way to go, but I really like the idea. Frank Villoria says, do wets or intermediate tyres really degrade all that much if continuously running on wet surfaces with not much heat build-up? I heard Seb radio that his Inters were knackered at one point. Yes, they do. I mean, well, it depends on the conditions. I mean, they will degrade, and what happens is, of course, they degrade really fast as soon as the circuit starts to dry out, or even if it starts to dry out in certain places, because they're designed to operate in wet conditions. And what happens with an Inter, or indeed a full wet, is that, of course, it's got these big, deep grooves cut in it. They're precision cut within the rubber, and they're creating these channels, just like a road car tyre, which disperses the water from the surface of the track, chucks it out the side, and allows the tyre tread to make contact with the road surface and maintain some level of grip rather than aquaplaning across the top. Now, gradually what happens is those precision cut grooves the rubber starts to wear, it starts to roll over, you start to get curved and very deformed edges, and essentially those channels become much less prominent and therefore much less effective. So as well as the tyres starting to degrade in terms of their grip levels, they also start to disperse much less water as they get worn down as well. And on a tyre that's treaded, of course, there's a lot more movement. In each of those tread sections, they move an awful lot. And as you start to get too much heat in those and you start to run them on a surface that may not be fully wet or as wet as they were intended for, that tyre starts to generate a huge amount of heat. It starts to roll over a lot more on each of those treaded sections. And of course, you massively build up each one of those small sections very quickly in terms of heat, and the degradation just comes very quickly. If it remains in wet conditions, yeah, they'd run for a long time, but they would start to degrade just nowhere near as quickly. The sort of curve, if you looked at it on a graph, degradation curve would be something like that. In wet conditions, it would be very linear, it would be very smooth and a shallow curve. The moment you start to get like a dry line or even a couple of dry corners, that degradation curve goes up very rapidly, and that's when they start to destroy themselves, literally within a couple of laps. Right, a couple more. Russell Durant says, when a driver of the calibre of Lewis Hamilton says to his pit crew, "It's too wet for slicks," do you think they should believe him? After all, Hamilton's usually the first to want to go on to slicks. Well, they do believe him. Nobody disbelieves him. What you have to remember, and we don't know everything that was going on the Mercedes pit wall. Of course, you're referring to the point that after the race, Lewis came out and said, you know, I didn't think it was really dry enough for slick tyres. I thought it was still too wet at the point the team put him onto them. You have to remember, though, that the team have a much bigger picture most of the time. Yes, they believe Lewis. Yes, they take his feedback very seriously. It's a critical part of the whole machine when it comes to strategy. But the team have all the information, and some of the critical information is looking at other cars and other drivers that are on the circuit at that time on the tyre that you're thinking of going to. And if their lap times suddenly start tumbling, it's clear to everybody that yes, it might be difficult, it might be more treacherous, but the performance benefit might be massive. So when you get somebody like Lance Stroll pull the trigger and decide to gamble and go for a dry tyre, and then everybody in the pit lane is watching Lance Stroll's sector times and even his mini sector times, and you start to see the performance coming to a point where it's undeniable that's the right tyre to be on. And I'm not saying this was the situation in that moment for Lewis, but that is what's happening up and down the pit lane. Then the team have all of that information that Lewis just doesn't have sat in the cockpit, and that might be where the team have to say, look, Lewis, I know it doesn't feel like it, but look, the lap times are saying this is the right tyre, and I have no doubt that when that conversation happens, Lewis is big enough and experienced enough and mature enough now to say to the team, okay, you know, let's go with it. I'll take your word for it. So just as the team has to believe Lewis's feedback, Lewis also has to believe the team's, because they got much more information to hand normally. Right, finally, this one, and this I hadn't seen, but this one comes from Robert, who says, and unbelievable, and shout out to M Sport Extra as well, by the way, because it's their original tweet, this one. I didn't know this had happened, but look at that. That is a Renault F1 truck on its way to Hungary, as the message says, completely off the road and over a sort of Armco barrier. Disaster. First of all, I hope everybody was okay. I don't know anything about this incident because I've been at work all day filming today, so I haven't really checked anything on the Formula One websites. I don't know what's going on. But I hope everybody was okay in the first instance. And the question from Robert is, so, Mark, how would one resolve this problem? And it is a big problem, isn't it? First of all, it's I imagine, you know, some of the team's equipment going to the Hungarian Grand Prix. I don't know what would be in the truck. It could be cars, or it could be garage equipment, it could be all sorts of things. But the big problem they've got now is, first of all, getting that truck back out of that situation, and then what do they do with all the equipment that has to get to Hungary in a hurry? Well, to answer the question, I mean, I don't know what you do. You get some help in dragging that trailer back out onto the road, but then they would probably be sending a spare truck, one of the test trucks or something, from back at Enstone to wherever that is, meet it, and perhaps literally be unloading stuff from one trailer into the other to be able to continue the journey, because it's very, very important, given that the Hungarian Grand Prix is just 7 days after the German Grand Prix, that whatever is in that, if it's critical stuff, needs to get to Hungary very, very quickly by road, which is not a short journey. So, yeah, not a good weekend all round for Renault, was it? It was disastrous from the start of Sunday to the end, by the look of it. So I hope everyone's okay. I hope they managed to get that stuff there in good time and in good condition. I'm sure they will, but there we go. Right, I hope you enjoyed some of that. Some really great questions, and loads more. I will try and continue to answer them either online, you know, myself, or perhaps in some more videos over the course of this week. But thank you. I really appreciate all of your time, for those of you that took the time to write one. Just finally, I need to give away the artwork by Joel Clark. If you remember that brilliant picture of the Porsches, the Le Mans class-winning Porsches from Joel Clark and the GPBox.com, I had so much fun with Rex and Ginger going through all of your jokes. If you remember, Ginger asked you to send in your jokes, and the funniest one would be the winner. Now, they're in bed right now, so I can't get them to take part in this video, but they have chosen a winner, and it was so funny going through them all. So thank you. Some of them really made me laugh as well. The winner, though, let me find it. Right, here it is. This one came from, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to read a couple of others. And right, what I'm going to do is there were three that they chose as being their funniest, and then they narrowed it down to this one that I'm about to pick as the winner on their behalf. But there were two others that I quite liked as well. One was, and I forget, apologies, I don't know who sent it. I haven't been able to find it right now, but one of them was there was a guy, here's a knock at his front door. He goes to the front door, and when he opens it, there's a snail on the doorstep. The man picks up the snail and throws it as far as he can down the garden. Goes back to his chair. 3 years later, there's a knock on the door. He opens the door. The same snail sat on the front doorstep. The snail says to him, "What'd you do that for?" I liked it anyway. The other was a joke that Rex in particular liked. What's the difference between roast chicken and pea soup? Anyone can roast chicken. Again, I liked it too, but the winner was this one that they both agreed on, so well done to Dry Out, who said, a student says to his teacher, "Will you tell me off for something I didn't do, miss?" The teacher says, "No, of course I won't." The student says, "I didn't do my homework then." Simple, but the kids loved it. It made them laugh out loud. So well done to you, Dry Out. That Joel Clark artwork is on its way to you, but thank you to everybody who sent in jokes. What a lovely way to give away a prize. It was a lot of fun. Thanks ever so much, guys. I hope you have a great week. I will be back in touch at some point over the course of this week. Certainly, if not before, because we've got another race this weekend. So I'll have a preview to the Hungarian Grand Prix on Thursday, but I hope I'll be back before that, because I think I've got a couple of days where I don't need to go off to site to do any filming, so I'll be here, hopefully able to put some more videos together. So thank you very much. Enjoy the week. Catch you soon. Ta-ra.